Welcome, everyone. We are so excited to have you here. My name is Shira Phelps, and I'm with the Office for Victims of Crime Human Trafficking Capacity Building Center, or the Center for short. The center sponsors the Ask an Expert series that you all are joining us for today. You can find previous webinars on the center's website. For this conversation, the center partnered with the Office on Trafficking in Persons National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center. We so appreciate their partnership and look forward to this discussion.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Suleiman Masood. I'm a subject matter expert on domestic labor trafficking and male victimization at the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center. I serve as a senior training and technical assistance specialist. It's a pleasure to be here today and a part of the Ask an Expert webinar. I look forward to this conversation about supporting men and boys who experience human trafficking. I want to thank everyone who registered for this event. It's my understanding that over 2,200 people registered to attend from all parts of the world. And additionally, I'd like to give a special acknowledgement to many of our attendees who are supporting tribal communities who are here with us. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge the significant loss of a leader, mentor, and friend in the anti-trafficking community. Out of respect for her family and friends, I'd like to keep her name private for this public webinar. However, it is without a doubt that she has opened doors for many, including myself, and left a lasting impact in the anti-trafficking field. Her legacy will continue to emphasize the importance of this work. The NSN is hosting an event today at 4 p.m. To 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or 1 to 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. This event is for survivors only. If you are a survivor and would like more information, please let us know in the chat. Now I'd like to provide some context for today's discussion. Human trafficking is a crime that involves exploiting a person for the purpose of compelled sex or labor. Anyone under the age of 18 who is engaged in commercial sex acts, regardless of the use of force, fraud, or coercion, is a victim of human trafficking. Sex trafficking is a form of human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation. Turning to labor trafficking is exploitation of an individual for financial gain, involving the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel a person to provide labor or services against their will. Our panelists today will address the services and support needed for men and boys who experience human trafficking and the differences and similarities to their female counterparts. Ensuring equity and inclusion of services for all individuals who experience human trafficking means addressing the needs of men and boys. Before I invite our panelists to introduce themselves, I want to mention a relatively new resource that was created by NITAC, or the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center, which is titled How to Improve Services for Males Experiencing Trafficking. The link will be provided in the chat, and that this document shares risk factors and ways to build rapport with male identified clients. Now let's get started. Joining me today are three dynamic presenters, Lenny Hayes, Bandak Lul, and Stephen Procopio. I invite each of them to introduce themselves. And first, I'd like to get started with Lenny. Lenny, if you could please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. Coming from my native community, I like to announce myself in my Indian name, which is Tukawanagi Luta, which means Redstone Ghost. My English name is Lenny Hayes, and I'm from the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate of the northeast corner of South Dakota. I am currently a mental and chemical health therapist. I currently own my own private practice, specifically working with individuals who identify as Two-Spirit or Native LGBTQ.
Thank you, Lenny. Bandak, would you go next, please?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Solomon. My name is Bandak Lul, and I'm a program specialist at the Office of the Attorney General of Texas, Human Trafficking and Transnational Organized Crime. I previously worked as a program manager at Arizona State University Office of Sex Trafficking and Intervention Research, where I published several articles on human trafficking among migrants and refugee populations, as I was previously an advocate through Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services. I implemented the first inner city outreach program in Arizona, where we did outreach to day laborers. We were working in urban area in Phoenix, Arizona, and I'm a graduate of Human Trafficking and Leadership Academy through NITACs as of 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, Bandak. And Stephen, would you please go next?
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be with you all today. My name is Stephen Procopio, and I'm a licensed independent clinical social worker in Boston. In December of 2007, I founded the first freestanding project for CSEC boys in the United States. And after having developed a couple of programs to two different organizations, I work now as a consultant doing international training on CSEC boys and young men. And I also do consultation with NGOs on program development using my model of service. And I also work as a therapist for adult survivors of sexual victimization across the lifespan. And a year ago, along with Jen and Suleiman, I worked with a group of providers and adult survivors, which result on a Men and Boys working group, which then resulted in the document on how to improve services for males that Suleiman just mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Lenny, Bandak, and Stephen, we really appreciate your time and look forward to this discussion. As a reminder to everyone attending, please submit your questions in the Q&A function that's located at the bottom of your screen. While participants, each of you begin to submit your questions, I'd like to get started with a few questions of my own. First question I'd like to pose is to Lenny. Lenny, what services and support are needed for men and boys who experience human trafficking?
Well, one of the things that I want to say is I come from the Native American community. And so my work is based on just working within tribal communities across Indian country. We, in our tribal communities, really need to understand, as community members, that when we talk about healing within our tribal communities or within our cultures, one of the things that I'm always specifying to people is that when we talk about healing our community, that means healing all of our genders, including males, females, and two-spirit people. And that's it's always been a really big challenge in our tribal communities because, again, our individuals who identify as two-spirit or Native LGBTQ are not always welcomed within our tribal communities. And so I really want to stress that, just because, I stress it in a good way too, because again, this is an issue that's also impacting our males and specifically our males who identify. So we do need a lot of education and awareness about male victimization. And one of the things I think is really important for us to remember too is that we have some good men out in our tribal communities who are trying to help other men heal from the different forms of victimization. And one of the things that we don't often do is that we don't invite these men to the table. So a lot of the men who are doing the work in our tribal communities are standing in the background, and we have not yet really created a space for them to even begin to start having these conversations about healing our communities. And, I always like to acknowledge the men that I know who are out there doing good work. For instance, Whirlwind Bull, who comes from the 3 affiliated tribes, who's doing talking circles with men. And the other individual that I also like to acknowledge too is Great Gray Cloud, who has a equine therapy program working with men and boys. And so again, I always like to remind our tribal communities too that, all of this victimization is just not one gender based. It's impacting everyone in our community. And we just need to create space. We don't have a lot of education and awareness in regards to any forms of victimization that are impacting our male population. So again, I just want to encourage us to open our minds, create safe space, and we need to have more conversation throughout Indian country on this topic.
Thank you, Lenny. Yeah, a lot of those transparent conversations, I think, really can set the tone for how a community perceives victimization of all genders. Bandak, Stephen, anything you'd like to add here?
Yeah, Lenny, I definitely 100% agree with you with what you're saying. It is no secret that the current services and support for victims of human trafficking are female-centric, including policymaking, victims identification, and person-level services, as well as the services that anti-trafficking movement is not. They're not serving male trafficking victims adequately. If we look back maybe 10 years ago, this might have been due to the fact that there was much to still be learned about human trafficking victimization of males. However, recent studies, particularly by Arizona State University, Office of Sex Trafficking Intervention Research, have demonstrated that male victims population that are particularly vulnerable to both sex trafficking and labor trafficking in the United States, including runaways, youth, homeless youth, and young adults, and migrant workers have similar experience to that of female trafficking victims. There's no significant differences between male and female victims regarding sex trafficking and labor trafficking victimizations. Negative life experiences, adverse child experiences, mental health, medical issues, as well as substance abuse issues are some of the risk factors that contribute to men and boys experiencing human trafficking. Therefore, I think it is imperative that victims of human trafficking in the United States receive the same level of attention and specialized services as female victims of human trafficking. Just like women and girls, I believe that men and boys need housing assistance, mental health services, medical assistance, employment services, emotional support, as well as legal assistance, which is, I think, is very important to point out, because I think just like women and girls, men and boys also do experience forced criminalities while they are being victimized. They are forced into other crimes that are not related to human trafficking with the experience. Thank you so much.
Well, just to dovetail a little bit of Bandak's statement, when I first started this program back in 2007, there was no research or data on sex trafficking or C-sex of boys or young men at all. So I started cold with this. And I did get a lot of pushback from various components of the community, letting me know that I had a long hill to climb because this was not in actuality an issue that men and boys faced. So we've really come a long way since I first started. So what was important to me at that time was to create my own data through my own research. So I did a series of focus groups with Boston youth from the ages of 13 to 16 and 16 to 24, and on many different topics related to trafficking. But the core issues that came up for these groups in terms of what services they needed were long-term supported housing. They needed a housing to get off the streets. They needed educational opportunities like achieving a GED or some other form of education. Of all the boys I've ever worked with, only one was able to successfully graduate high school. Job training and placement. I'm an excellent and big push for each state in the union has a state rehabilitation system, and they're really quite good at doing job counseling, job testing, job referrals, and job coaching for people. And also long-term behavioral health, which we weren't trauma focused back in the day because we didn't have those words, but now we do. And then compassionate medical care. Above and beyond those core issues, it's important to know that each client is unique unto himself. And with that is specialized individual treatment plan to be able to deal with all the myriad of ancillary issues that they need to work on from the case manager. And all of this really needs to be done from a multidisciplinary perspective.
Sorry about that. Trying to find the unmute. Thank you, Lenny. And thank you, Bandak and Stephen. Want to move to, before I move to the next question for Bandak, there was a request in the chat for each of us to provide our preferred pronouns. So if we can just address that. So my preferred pronouns are he, him, and his. Lenny, Bandak, or Stephen, if you'd like to go next.
Well, I don't use pronouns. And I'm sure you're all wondering why I don't use pronouns, but for me, as a Native person, I believe that pronouns is a form of colonization. And when we talk about pronouns, and specifically coming from tribal communities, we have to understand that some of us in our tribal communities don't have words for pronouns. And so I don't mean to be disrespectful to the people who use them, but I've always been trying to teach others that what we should be doing is asking people, if you prefer to use pronouns, which ones, instead of saying which pronouns do you use. Thank you.
I don't use pronouns either.
Lenny, just hearing you out now, thinking back to my own culture in the East African community in the Nuer tribe, we actually don't use pronouns either, but I do go by he, him, and his, through the colonization, as you mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah, again, I think with this discussion, what we're going to find is it's really important that we're finding ways to be as inclusive as possible, and I think making sure that we're also respecting not using pronouns, right? Because again, if there are indicators, there are identifiers, there may be a higher risk that a certain population or group of individuals may be missed, right? So I also want to just extend that thank you to each of you for also providing that reminder. Bandak, my next question is for you. Are the needs and services of someone in a labor trafficking situation different from someone who has experienced sex trafficking?
Thank you for that question, Solomon. As I mentioned earlier, that I implemented the first day labor outreach in inner city America last year through fundings from NITAC as well as support from Arizona State University. The population that we worked with in Phoenix was majority male populations, and what we came to find out, based on those experiences, that needs and services of someone in labor trafficking situation have no significant differences from someone experiencing sex trafficking. Providing person-centered and trauma-informed services to victims of human trafficking essential to their needs by offering opportunities for educational and economic advancement, and these support services can help stabilize the victims, and that's what we try to do while we did our community outreaches. Victims can become economically and personally independent when they obtain an education, gain new job skills, develops life and social skills, learn a new language, and gain and obtain employment. And I can personally attest to this, not because I'm not a survivor, but because I'm a migrant and a refugee who came to the United States not knowing a word in English. All I knew was how to ask for water, which in British that colonized Sudan at the time was water, if most of you know that. But I can attest to this, how gaining a new job skills at the time, and also developing new life skills as well as social skills, and having to adapt to a new culture and having all those resources at the time really did help me a lot, not only through my educational background and also experiences, but also through employment, through my community, through interaction, and which brought me here today speaking to you in English and being able to articulate things in a way that I would have not otherwise done so. So education and personal level care is very important when it comes to serving victims of human trafficking, not only sex trafficking victims, but both male trafficking victims as well. When it comes to labor trafficking alone, service provider that's focused on personal level response as well as trauma-informed can be encouraged to collaborate with agencies that are credible, trauma-informed, and who are familiar with the complex nature of labor trafficking and immigration laws for victims who are foreign nationals. Thank you for that question, Solomon.
Of course, Mandak, and yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing, the really big takeaway is how much of a role culture can play in service provision, and it really is important for those service providers to get a deep understanding, right? Especially when in certain cultures, when there is a trafficking situation, it doesn't just affect the individual, it affects the community, affects the family, right? And understanding how culture plays a role in that really is important for healing.
Definitely.
So just want to state, so questions, I'm seeing questions coming into the Q&A. I want to thank you all for that. Please continue to do so. Please continue to find questions that you think that these wonderful experts can help speak to. Stephen, my last question is for you, and then we'll go to the participant questions. So Stephen, how can an organization get the word out about their services for men and boys?
Well, I think the first thing that's important is that, the organization, I'm not sure if organizations are specific to trafficking or they're multidisciplinary within the organization. So I'm going to go under the assumption for the multidisciplinary organization, internal training, I think, is really critical to be able to work with staff on dealing with any biases that they might have working with this particular population. In my experience here, and from what I've heard from others that I've trained over the years, there's inherent biases towards male victims of trafficking or CSIC organizationally. So I think that's something that organizations really need to do, is take the pulse on that for them, and then be able to move forward. For those organizations that are specific to trafficking, ongoing training and research development, and also reading all the latest research that is out on this particular topic, I think is critical. Another thing that I found beneficial for me is to develop partnerships within your community with other community-based organizations from a multidisciplinary perspective. So given the services that Bandak and I have already mentioned, it's going to be important to develop partnerships with housing, medical, mental health, emergency rooms, and educational systems to be able to work along with those people to help move the youth through those various systems. And I'm also big on developing consortiums. So I, in my work here with those groups of community partnerships, we met monthly for networking meetings to do case consultation and to help kids deal with those various systems if the youth found that dealing with medical was becoming a problem for them because they didn't have the right type of provider or whatnot. So to keep that going is, I think, very important to develop a consortium based on multidisciplinary. And then ongoing training. I'm very big on training. We're always learning something new with this population, and I think it's important for us to stay on top of that.
Thank you, Stephen. Just as human trafficking continues to evolve, our service provision needs to evolve, and that really goes with that ongoing training. I'd like to open this up question to both Bandak and Lenny as well, and just repeating the question, how can an organization get the word out about their services for men and boys? And I can start with Lenny.
So one of the things that I want to talk about, I mean, coming from a tribal community perspective, is that, this is a topic that we don't talk about. We don't even sort of acknowledge it, maybe through side conversations, but when it comes to, out in community events, presentations like that, it's not a huge topic to talk about, nor is like any type of violence that's perpetrated upon men and boys. One of the things that I've been myself going across Indian country talking about, human trafficking and sexual assault on men and boys, one of the things I keep reminding my community, because, the way that we view Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ, our view of this population has changed because of colonization. And that's one of the things that I always want to remind people, and also the fact that when we, in our tribal communities, there's no such word for lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. There's a specific word in our tribal communities that identifies individuals like me. The other piece is like reconnecting and understanding that colonization has impacted this population. So one of the things that I do when I go out in tribal communities and have conversation and present about this issue, the thing that I always remind people is that my identity as a two-spirit person doesn't define what happened to me through my own sexual violence that was perpetrated upon me. I was born a two-spirit. And so the other thing that I often try to stay away from is just talking specifically about the Native LGBTQ community, or specifically talking about individuals who identify as two-spirit, because we need to get away from that. I am, like I said earlier, I am a male who was impacted by some form of violence. That's who I am. But what we often do is we're still stuck on that idea that it's individuals who identify are the ones who are impacted by these different forms of violence, and that's not true. So we really do need to work on our biases, our own personal biases, our biases within our organizations. We have so much work to do, but my hope is that I'm part of this movement so that we can create change in our tribal communities.
Thank you, Lenny. And Bandak, given your expertise and understanding on asylees, refugees, and as well as working with migratory communities, can you speak to how outreach, because you did provide labor trafficking outreach, right? How outreach can provide a strong impact in providing provisional services for men and boys?
Yes, Solomon, thank you for that. But before I answer that question, I might come back to you to ask for it later. But I just wanted to touch base on what Len had just mentioned about gender, because I think gender plays a huge role when it comes to servings, as well as societal roles about the expectations, as well as how a man or a male should act in our society. During the HTLA Class 6, our cohort came up with some of the factors that contribute to male victims' vulnerabilities, and one of those was machismo. And machismo, for most men and boys, being able to develop a deep sense of emotional intelligence is one of the challenges that men and boys face, and there's no, denying to that. And mixed with racial and gender inequality, most migrants, men in labor trafficking are given only one choice most of the time, and this is to wake up early at 5 a.m. In the fields or on the street corner, seeking day job that pay them sometimes less than $5 an hour at the max. Sometimes they don't get paid at all. Most of the time, they are working 12 hours or more. Even worse in the agriculture field industries, because there is no limits on how many hours a person can work in the United States when it comes to agricultural. Industry. Most men's value that you can attain as a man is one's ability to dominate, to control, to succeed at all costs. And in the world of labor trafficking, machismo is used as a negative motivator for victims to succeed. The masculinity, identity, and responsibility to care for one's family is preyed on, while traffickers trick their victims into working in unsafe environments by paying them below market values. Men and boys do not question their lifestyle in labor trafficking and the way they live while priding themselves for providing for their families. And I think as a society, we have a duty to change that narrative as well. Men do experience hardships and pain, and as well as compared to their to females victims. Seeking emotional support and safety planning and mental services should not be treated as a sign of weakness. It should be treated as a strength. So I just wanted to touch base on that when it comes to gender perspectives, particularly for male victims of labor trafficking who are migrants populations as well. Like I said, Solomon, I would come back to you for that question, but I'll give you 30 seconds to answer that. What was it again? Sorry.
Yeah, it's similar. It really is just in line with everything that you've said, but just given your expertise and understanding what labor trafficking looks like, right? What the needs are of migratory, asylee, and refugee communities. What service provision may look like among those communities and those that have individuals who identify as male.
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing that we've missed, in the anti-trafficking sense, like maybe the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, is the lack of bringing the community together, collaborations. In Phoenix, I was able to bring, on board the Consulate General of Mexico, the Consul General of Guatemala, Chicana por la Costa, International Rescue Committee, the McCain Institute, all these organizations, including Arizona State University, to come together to provide services where services are lacking. an agency from Guatemala will not be able to provide passport services to a victim who was coming from Mexico. And that's why it was important to bring all these services, service provider together, all these agencies together to collaborate to fill in those gaps. So you have to be able to recognize the gaps that you're missing when you're providing services. Thank you.
Thank you, Bandak. So at this point, I want to move on to our Q&A. So again, I want to provide a quick reminder to everyone that all the questions that are being answered today will be provided in a summary document and will be emailed to all of you as well as a recording of today's event. So the first question that I'm seeing in a common theme, I had a chance to look at the Q&A questions. Common theme is trying to differentiate between service provision for males versus females. So one question that I think could help start us off, and Lenny, I'd like to ask you if that's okay. The question is to help provide an overview or help to provide an understanding of the daily experience of a male victim of trafficking. What might be some day-to-day challenges and realities that may differ from an individual who identifies as female? Yeah, I'll stop there.
So one of the things I think is really important, again, to go back to checking our own personal biases and how we view males or even individuals who identify as Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ in regards to any forms of violence, including trafficking, is that if we don't do that, if we don't check our own biases, what that means is then we're not going to be giving them the proper services that they need. So for instance, I had an advocate reach out to me, a female advocate, and her question to me was, how do I work with a man that was raped by another man? And my response to her was, well, you would work with him just like you would work with a female. And remember, I'm coming from a cultural, tribal perspective in how we're taught in treating people, individuals, our relatives. And so by the time we were done with our conversation, she was able to define that she had her own personal biases in regards to a man raping another man. So again, you know, until we start to address that bias, we're never going to properly serve male victims and even our Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people, and really, really, truly understand how much historical and intergenerational trauma has impacted our community, how our views were changed when the missionaries and Europeans came in and, you know, did a lot of horrible things to our Native population. And again, you know, we have to go back to that traditional cultural view in how we view the people in our communities. So, you know, there's just, again, going back to what I said earlier, there's so much more work that we need to do in our communities. But again, if we're going to heal our communities, that includes all of our genders, females, males, and Two-Spirit people. But I do have to say, like what Stephen had said earlier, I remember when I came into this area of even just talking about violence against Two-Spirit people, things have changed in the last 10 years, where a lot of our tribal coalitions, a lot of our tribal organizations across Indian country are now beginning to have conversations about individuals who identify, which is good, right? But we got so much more work to do. And again, I just want to acknowledge all the Native women who are my teachers, my mentors, who brought me to this place of being able to speak about, you know, the violence that's perpetrated upon men and boys. And then I quickly want to say something about having conversations with people from different communities, tribal communities, and asking that question, do you think labor trafficking is occurring in our Native communities? And that was very difficult for us to even answer, because again, that's something that we don't talk about. And the response from all the individuals that I heard or that I talked to, they basically said it's a possibility. So again, we have to think about even labor trafficking impacting our Native people.
Thank you, Lenny. Stephen, next question is for you. So there was a question about what services are needed for males. So you spoke to the different types of services that individuals who identify as males need, right? And that you'd mentioned, you know, looking at, just as how Lenny and Bandak have also shared in their remarks. It's important to treat each client or individual who you are providing services for differently, right? Tailor that approach. Could you help expand on what that means when it comes to providing services for males who experience trafficking?
Well, given the focus groups I did and how I modeled my program, each of the youth that we worked with, some were homeless, some were not. Some had substance issues, others did not. Some had, most of them had educational issues. And so when you're I think what we may forget is that when we are working with CSEC kids or trafficked kids, that comes from a long history of trauma. It just doesn't start when you're 16 years old. So, their kids come from home with domestic violence. The kids are sexually abused in their home. So given that, I think you really need to tailor, their survivor, the youth at risk comes first in terms of what they need based on how they identify. You can have a general framework, but you need to be flexible enough to accommodate the diverse needs. I think Bandoc and I had a conversation the last time. We also have this awareness that there's not a lot of difference between males and females when it comes to services that they're needed. I found with the girls projects I've worked with here that there's much more commonality than difference. And we'd like to sort of think that there's so much difference when really they're not. And the other thing I want to be able to stress that I keep forgetting, this is not a sexual orientation issue. Regardless of what your sexual orientation is, you are prime for being trafficked if you have any number of pre-trauma, adverse childhood experiences in your life. I've always heard, oh, Stephen, we're glad what you're doing for the gay kids, even though I've done a training and tell you it's not a gay issue, that people really need to be open to the vulnerability of our youth with complex trauma and prior sexual victimization, because I think for both boys and girls, there's a very high rate of childhood sexual abuse that's a precursor to the trafficking. So I think we really need to be open around similarities and not so much the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I saw Lenny in the chat mention that this is a human issue. It absolutely is. One quick follow-up question I have, right? As this is something, and I hate to be the person to plug it, but in the tool that we created that you helped lead us in writing was the how to experience trafficking, how to improve services for males experiencing trafficking. In this tool that talks about how to address victimization, right? There's a specific type of tool that in way of asking questions was through universal education and motivational interviewing. These are the two types of tools that were addressed, or two methods that were addressed in the tool that really get at how you're not asking why. Why did you go through this? Why did you do this? Why didn't you call the police? Could you speak a little bit more of what the impact of universal education and motivational interviewing can have on individuals of all genders?
You're asking that of me?
I am.
Just generally speaking, what I found, the motivational interviewing was not around when I first started this. So I was new at this as, the years went by and we learned more about motivational interviewing. I think one of the struggles I hear from providers is, well, we're not serving boys because they're not identifying. And, there's any number of reasons why they're not identifying. And I think a lot of it is there's a problem in the communication between the provider and the youth around getting information on life experience and how that might be a risk factor for them. So I think, and I really strongly believe that work with kids is all relationship based. It's all relational, and kids under normal conditions don't trust adults, let alone kids that have been victimized. So a lot of the conversation is, for me, relational in terms of how you relate to a kid, in terms of not zoning in so much, well, are you being trafficked? Are you selling sex, selling your body for money or whatever, which is going to alienate kids. But it's just, for me, it's more of a matter of getting to know the kid, establishing a relationship, and then having the conversation. I worked with one kid who didn't even disclose to me for the first 16 months that I worked with him, and others disclosed. And this kid with a 16-month wait period before he just had so much distrust of adults and what his experience and fear of what was going to happen to him if he disclosed, that I don't think any amount of questioning would have helped at that point. Not that I'm against motivational interviewing, but I don't think that's the only tool. I think a lot of it's relational.
Absolutely. And really the takeaway that I have is the burden really should not be on the individual to self-identify and be the person that is really walking around telling everyone, hey, I need help because of the intimate details of my trauma, right? It really has to go, that burden has to shift to those service providers to help create an open, safe, and inclusive space.
And I think we need to also be, especially for non-gay youth, we need to be aware of the shame and guilt of sexual victimization if the perp is a male. So, and I think there's enough shame and guilt that goes on for boys, generally speaking, but especially in the non-gay community, these boys are so underground with this situation based on shame and guilt and their fear of how they're going to be identified if they do disclose. So yeah, that's another.
Great point. Bandak, next question I'd like to pose to you. So earlier in our conversation, you discussed about the culture and stigma around machismo, right? For those who identify as male, to whether it's societal expectations or cultural expectations to not disclose. How can we address men and boys being hesitant to report because of societal perceptions of masculinity and victimization?
Sorry about that, I had to unmute. Thank you for that question, Solomon. I think we really, like Lenny and Stephen had already mentioned, we need to look into our own, perspective and also bias on when it comes to gender, anything that has to affect, both male and female victims as well. You often see gender-based violence, even when it comes to topics like that in academia. When you hear gender-based violence, it's mostly, female-centric. It's not always, inclusive on all gender and also sexual orientation as well. I think in our, we need to really have to, ensure that, we treat male victims as, as who they are, who they identify, who they want to identify, and also when having conversation with them, one of the best way we can, approach them is ask open-ended questions. And that's one of the things that we realized in Arizona while working in the field. We realized that was working. We asked open-ended questions. Likely, we had interpreters who actually knew what they were doing through, from Chicana per la Causa and also the McCain's Institute. We were translating, with us. Asking open-ended questions, like Stephen said earlier, so what do you do when you are, with your employer? How many people are you with, when you are, being transported to one workplace into another? And also, is the person that transporting you a middleman, or is it, your actual employer that, was paid, that was paying, the middleman to take those your compensation and money and things like that. So we really need to listen to how men speak about their experience, and also to actually not see them as, as victims, and also blame them and shame them in that way, like Stephen has said earlier. Thank you.
I just want to quickly, if I could, I'm sorry, Laney, I just quickly mentioned Doc and I had a conversation last time, and we don't want to forget the intersection between labor and sex trafficking. So we don't want to say, okay, you're a sex traffic and you're labor traffic, which may be true, but we also want to be aware that we need to also look at that intersection for males between labor and sex trafficking. Okay, I'll be quiet.
Yes, yeah, definitely, Stephen, I agree 100%. Through research, also, through findings, and in the community outreach, we do come to realize that labor trafficking and sex trafficking do overlap a lot. And when you're asking those questions, there are a lot of sexual assault that are happening, and also, exploitation through commercial sex, of victims, particularly males as well. That happens to them. So you're right. Solomon, I don't want to take too much time. This is so good.
Not a problem. Lenny, I believe you also wanted to share as well.
Yes, please. One of the things that I wanted to also remind people too, that sometimes specifically these Western tools don't always work for individuals who identify as Native. And so we really need to understand that. So one of the things I always say is, for myself, healing from the violence that was put on me, I healed both the Western way, but also a huge part of it was that cultural and spiritual aspect of healing. And so, often sometimes, that tool, that interviewing tool doesn't always work in our communities, and we need to really understand that. So I know that I'm not too sure really who developed, but there is some like Native specific tools to use out there to be able to do motivational interviewing with individuals in our community, and just really understanding that those Western tools doesn't really fit into our cultural understanding either. So I really wanted to put that out there just to remind people of that also.
Thank you, Lenny. And thinking through on culture as well, culture playing a part of the healing, right? And embracing many different cultures in order to ensure that we are being accommodated for, and that the service provider really understands where culture comes from and how culture can be embraced. I'd like to ask you, Lenny, if you'd be willing to share some topics that men and boys may need to address in their aftercare. So following a victimization, even if an individual is going, they're continuing ways to share or go through different outlets to healing, to think through on what are some topics that men and boys may need to address. The individual who posed the question states, I work with female trafficking survivors and we focus a lot on boundaries, codependency, identity, self-esteem. Are there specific topics needed for men and boys?
Oh gosh. Well, again, I'm coming from a perspective of a tribal Native perspective when we talk about these issues. I think it's really important for us to remember that if we continue to use that Western language that we use, a lot of the men who have healed are standing in the background, not coming forward to help because we're using that Western language. And I really want to help people to understand that. So I'm going to share what an elder shared with me. When I was presenting and talking about my own violence, one of the things she said is, I want you to stop using that word trigger. And trigger is a Western word, right? And she said, that's a very powerful word. She said, we as Indian people believe everything has a spirit, the rocks, the trees. And so she said, even your emotions and your feelings, everything that you're experiencing, those have spirits, right? So when you're angry, you're sad, you're confused, those are spirits that are coming to visit you. So when we use the word trigger, looking at it in a cultural perspective, that's a very powerful negative word that keeps us stuck. So for me, even being a survivor, I still have times where I may watch a movie or read a book that has to do with violence and it still impacts me. If I acknowledge it and see it first, so then what I do is I say, I see you, I feel you, and now you can go away, knowing that that spirit is going to come back and visit. So that's what I mean about like really changing our views, or combining our whatever works for an individual. I'm not saying that we have to do it the way that I've done it, but also giving that understanding about the healing aspect. So, and one of the things too is that we really have to like think about how much shame comes from sexual violence and even the trafficking piece. I mean, I've been able to sit with males, one specifically talking about his trafficking experience, but he didn't name it, right? But I knew that he was being trafficked. And so understanding that he has to come to that place to identify that's what happened to him, but all I could do is sit and support him and help him not I mean, that shame was strong, right? And it's all of these views that are put on male population in all communities, right? In all aspects. But shame can be something that could be really, which can prevent somebody from healing. And you know, there's only one research project that's been out there by NIJ that did the research on violence against Native women and Native women and men. And I believe in there, they said 400 some thousand men were impacted by sexual violence. I believe that's much more higher, because we have to think about all of the ones who are kept silent and they're not coming forward, they're not disclosing, right? And we know that it's an issue that's impacting our Indian communities, because I can tell you many times that grown men have come to me after a presentation and they've all disclosed, you know, so I know that this is an issue.
Thank you, Lenny. And I'd like to just briefly open it up to both Stephen and Bandak. If you could share some topics that men and boys may need to address in their aftercare.
Well, you know, I have to dovetail what Lenny said. The adult males that I work with now, regardless where they are in their, and they're all pretty much leading relatively successful lives now. The bottom line is shame, guilt, and anger. And working with a 57-year-old man who was trafficked at 16, periodically will come to me and say, I'm having one of my days where I feel like I should have stopped this. I was the guy. And I think that underlying shame and guilt and anger and depression is lifelong, unfortunately. But there's, you know, as a therapist, it's my job to help develop strategies for them, not to tell them not to remember, because you're always going to be remembering. But when those thoughts come to you, when the memories come to you, how do you then begin to work it to be able to nurture and support yourself? So as they come to you, those memories can move on and you can go back to your life. But I think so many men have asked me, when are my memories of this going to stop? When is my shame and guilt going to stop? And as a therapist, I know it's not going to, but so my work with them is how to help them deal with those memories when it comes up and acknowledge how they're feeling and what you need to do to be able to move forward in those periodic times when you have your drop.
Amazing, Stephen. I've traveled around the world, and you know, from West Africa to East Africa to, you know, Greece to Belgium and Canada and all, you know, and I came to find out the same things, you know, about men, you know, the way males are. And one of the, you know, the most difficult things is that at certain point in development, often mid adolescents, boys get this notion that they are supposed to be self-sufficient and keep their feelings to themselves, just like Lenny and Stephen said earlier. That is often, you know, due to fear, peer pressure, and is involving themselves to getting included for being too expressive, being feminine. I think, you know, at some point we need to, you know, realize that it's okay as a man to be vulnerable. It's okay for you to, you know, speak about your experience. Vulnerability is one of the things that, you know, can get you through your experience as the victims of human trafficking. So for men and boys out there that are, you know, experiencing any difficulties or to express themselves, I just want to say that it's okay to be vulnerable. Thank you.
And I think that is a great point to end with our portion of the questions. I want to thank each of you. Just thank you so much for sharing your perspectives, sharing your experience. Everyone here, I just want to thank Lenny, Bandak, and Stephen for sharing and spending your time with us today. The links to the NITAC and Human Trafficking Capacity Building Center websites are in the chat for more human trafficking resources. They will also be emailed out to you. If you have any questions, feel free to let us know. But we hope you find that good use in these resources in your work, and we hope that you found today's session informative. Thank you all so much for your time.